Hello and welcome back to another episode. Now today I really want to talk about the Batmobile. This is one of my favourite, I suppose, geeky topics. Not least because I think the Batmobile is an interesting idea. If you think about it, the Batmobile is always represented, and not only, I suppose, what we associate with Batman, but also what we associate with high technology and the sort of vehicle that a wealthy person can drive. Often, for example, the features that we see in Batmobiles are reflected in sports cars of their day, or they soon make their way into sports car designs like Lamborghinis and this kind of thing. And so the Batmobile is a fascinating icon of comics, of design, and also of aspiration. And so I think lots of little boys, lots of little girls, lots of people sort of grow up thinking about and wanting to have a Batmobile. And so in that sense, really, it depends on what you think of Batman as to what you're likely to think of the Batmobile. For example, in the early 1940s, the Batmobile was little more than just a sports car. Because at the time, Bruce Wayne driving around in a sports car was aspirational and high technology. People were like, wow, that's cool. And he'd get from place to place in basically a sports car with the windows up. By 1942, the Batmobile is somewhat flamboyant. It's got like a peacockish kind of visage, and it's very much again reflecting the criminal underworld that's being portrayed, which isn't particularly realistic, and also the Batman and the character and the psychology, which is again not as grim as later generations would expect from Batman. By 1985, we have that truly swung the other way with Frank Miller's epic, The Dark Knight Returns. The Batmobile in that is monstrous, it's bloated, it's violent, it's uncompromising, and so too was Batman in that story. So at the end of his career, he's a Batman who really rides the line when it comes to dispensing justice and his particular view on the future for Gotham City. So the Batmobile is a point of fascination for me, not only as essentially a boy, as a geek, and someone who wants to play with Batmobile and drive one, but also actually intellectually it's a very interesting phenomenon. And so I've chosen my 5 favourite Batmobiles. I just want to talk a little bit about them today. The first Batmobile I really was aware of was the 1989 Batmobile. This is from Tim Burton's Batman film, and it obviously is Michael Keaton's Batman that we're talking about here. This particular toy is my original, and it's the one which I lost under so many sofas, just playing with it basically. Just sort of get away from me because it has excellent wheels. These wheels are superb. But for a long time, this was just the Batmobile. I didn't really have a sense that there was or could be another type of Batmobile, because obviously, when you're that age, everything is brand new and no one else has ever seen this stuff before. When I got the ultimate guide to the Dark Knight a few years later, obviously in there they talk about the Batmobile, and much to my satisfaction, they had Tim Burton, Michael Keaton's Batmobile front and centre, here we go, but also they had all these other Batmobiles referenced off to the side, the BM4, the BM3, the Hot Rod there, the Drag Racer, and they gave you a sense that actually, or they gave me a sense that actually the Batman's Batmobile and his world moved with the times, and this at the time was the most recent incarnation of the Batmobile. Fairly funky, but also fairly, I suppose, again of its time, fairly aggressive, fairly pointy, and also a Batmobile that didn't have a face on the front. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I suppose my favourite element of the Michael Keaton Batman, and especially the Batmobile in particular, was the way that he, for example, works on the Batmobile himself. We see him in the movie, in the second movie, doing repairs on it, but also how it shrunk down into that little sort of cigar tube type vehicle to squeeze through an alleyway in that film. So this was my first, and at the time my only love when it came to Batman. But that didn't last for too long. By 1992, a new Batman was on my horizon, certainly, and that Batman can be summed up in this vehicle here. This is the 1992 Batmobile, the dragster racer. This is actually the toy which also really very funkily has a sort of a bat plane built into it, which is extremely cool. And the wings fold up, and here we go. And the Batman who fits this is on the shelf behind me. This very quickly became my favourite Batmobile, because this was the Batmobile that I was seeing on Saturday mornings when they were showing the Batman animated series, which recently I've purchased volumes 1 and 2 of, and rewatching them with my wife. I'll talk about that in a later video. When I watched that, I was hooked on the sleekness of this design. I loved the straight lines, the elongated nature of the car. I absolutely loved the back of the car with the head, the brake lights, and the prominent exhaust ports. And actually, also incidentally, I have painted this up myself. I couldn't resist it in terms of painting it up. I also loved on the toy features such as this. It's a wheel shredder that sort of comes out of the car there. So this was the cool one for me for a long time, and I also particularly liked the fact that we got to see its origins in the movie The Mask of the Phantasm, where Batman and Bruce and his fiancée are touring a sort of an expo of the future, how great the future will be, and in there we see a car that's kind of like this. So I like that this car has a pedigree. But more than that, I love its design, its sleekness, its coolness, and the fact that you can imagine this car just coming past you and not quite knowing what to do as a citizen of Gotham. Now, come 1995, I was 10 or going on 11 years old, and I was ready for something different from Batman. The animated series had delivered what remains for me actually my favourite incarnation of Batman. But at the time I was ready to see something new, and Batman Forever, the movie, delivered something new. It took Tim Burton's vision of Batman and gave it a sort of a slightly, dare I say it, scarier edge. Quite literally, you felt as though you were going into an overwhelming day-glow UV spiky dark underworld sense of Gotham, and that was something which I found very interesting at that age. Obviously we all know the abomination that would follow in the shape of Batman and Robin, and also the Batmobile in that film is just terrible. But in Batman Forever I loved the Batmobile. I cannot tell you how much I loved it. I loved the fact that just as the city was sort of lighting up at night, the Batmobile also actually lights up at night. Let me just see if I can, there you go. So if you can sort of see this lighting up in there. The ribs of the Batmobile, the fact that it felt like there was something rumbling and brewing underneath inside the car, the fact that you had this giant sort of wing emanating from the back that could be sort of put up for speed or made wider for sort of cruising around corners, was just incredibly cool. It was ostentatious, it was bigger than it had to be, and in the same way that the flames would jet out of the back, you also had the sense of the car just going, get out of my way kind of thing. It was incredibly cool. And now, as with most of the toys, there are elements which weren't in the film. For example, here we have these bits here come up to sort of reveal guns, I suppose, after a fashion. But I could forgive that. As a kid, I sort of expected extra features. There's also actually a rocket that shoots out the front there. But what mattered to me most was the design, and even, for example, the silhouette of this vehicle was cool. The way that the wheels came out, the arches, the pointy elements. It was a grim and confident and slightly, I suppose, scary vision of Batman and the Batmobile. This was also actually the shortest lived Batmobile as well. This one didn't even last it through the entire movie, with the Riddler in the shape of Jim Carrey blowing the thing up. But I just thought this was the coolest machine I'd ever seen, and when I got it as a toy, I simply didn't stop playing with it. For a little while actually, it did knock the animated series Batmobile into a draw. But yeah, it was cool, and this is why it's in my top 5 Batmobiles. I suppose the one thing which really put me off off this Batmobile, only a couple of years later, was the weird manoeuvre it does where it drives up a wall. In the film, it sort of ends up, there's like a blast of heat that comes out the bottom of a rocket. It sort of that launches the car up in the air a bit. It shoots a grappling hook, goes on a wall and drives away. And well, after watching the film a couple of times, you sort of realise, well, what does he do when he gets to the top of that wall? Does he drive on the roofs and then rooftops, and then what happens next? It made no sense. And I don't know, I was a child who also liked things to make sense. So as much as this was cool, it's a little bit tarnished by, again, I suppose, Joel Schumacher. Now, if it hadn't been for Joel Schumacher, we wouldn't have had the Batman crash, as it were, and then the resurgence of Batman in the shape of the Christopher Nolan trilogy. His vision for Batman was utilitarian. Where did Batman get the tools to make himself Batman? Why was he doing this? What was the point of dressing as a bat? And also, what was the point of having a Batmobile? All of these questions were answered very thoughtfully. Batman dresses as a bat to scare people, and also his costume doubles as body armour and also as a hang glider almost. The Batmobile is designed to be, well, a mode of transport that is largely invulnerable to attack, but ultimately the reason why it has an afterburner on the back is because in Nolan's film at least, it was designed to jump over rivers, towing the elements of a bridge behind it. This was a combat vehicle, and Batman was using it simply out of its native territory. In many ways, the Batmobile, as it had always been, was a vehicle that was not quite not quite fitting in, and the Nolan films ran with that. This is not meant to fit in. This is a combat vehicle. It just so happens that Batman's deployed it in Gotham City. I very much appreciate the design. It's something new and different. There are elements of a bat in there if you want to find it. The way in which the front wheels don't have an axle linking them, the sort of almost look like the pointy ears of a bat. And I liked the sort of the shape of the Batmobile, almost sort of bending and arching on its frame. Essentially, got the sense that this was a vehicle designed to have excellent stability and suspension. Inside, as with almost pretty much all my Batmobiles, there we go. Inside we have Batman waiting to kick some ass, and as with again all the toys, we have elements which are, well, not strictly speaking in the movies. For example, here there's a button on top that sort of releases these things, and you can push those to launch those. I suppose it's a little bit like the release of the Millennium Falcon recently, where they felt the need to put a giant gun in the top of it. It's not in the movies, it's not even necessarily in fitting with the character or characters, but the toy manufacturers feel the need to quick, shove, pop out guns on it. Nonetheless, I loved this Batmobile. At first I think I found it a bit odd though. I remember seeing early sort of leaked imagery, mobile phone footage of it driving round, and while I loved the sound it made, the sort of the guttural engine, I wasn't entirely sold on especially this portion here. For some reason I didn't like it in that footage. But it very quickly grew on me, and I really like, again, the double wheels at the back. It feels functional, it feels tactical, it feels, well, it feels grown up. And I suppose that's ultimately the whole point of the Nolan trilogy, was that Batman was kind of grown up, and if you're going to be a bat, there needs to be a good reason for it. And I suppose that's the point, really, of the Nolan trilogy, of the Dark Knight trilogy, was to reclaim Batman, to give him a good reason to exist, which wasn't incredibly silly as it had been in Batman and Robin. And this logic followed through with the vehicles. As I've already said with the Tumbler, there was a logic there. But in the second movie, in The Dark Knight, Batman, halfway through, changes to the Bat Pod. Now, the pod is actually the two front wheels of the Tumbler, having ejected essentially from the machine after the Batmobile, the Tumbler, is incapacitated by a well-aimed rocket from the Joker. The way in which the two front wheels of that vehicle launch, and the awesomeness of that rush, is one of the defining moments of the Dark Knight movie. But also, I think went on to mean that actually the impact of this vehicle meant that in the third film, The Dark Knight Rises, they didn't feel the need to have a reincarnation of the Batmobile, or even to actually reconstruct the Batmobile officially. The Bat Pod, as it came to be known, had such an introduction, it really stuck with us. It's a gorgeous vehicle, and it's a wonderful, again, technical explanation of well, how do you eject yourself from the Batmobile? In the case of Tim Burton's imagining, it sort of became the sort of little cigar shape, and this was essentially that idea amped up to 11. You launch out of the front of the vehicle using the two front wheels, and the way in which as well that these wheels can spin not only like that but also like that meant that he could turn corners and do all sorts of cool things in that film. So this also has a place in my heart, and this is, I suppose, this is in my top 5 for that reason, I guess. Well, top 5.5, I guess. Now, it's really hard for me to actually say which one of these is my favourite. I suppose it depends on who I was at the time when they came out. If you'd asked me which one was my favourite, I would have given you a different answer. But also, these days, it depends on what mood I'm in, I suppose. But probably one of the most interesting, or the most interesting Batmobile for me, is one which I didn't realise they'd done a toy of. Now, those of you who've watched previous videos of mine may already know about this, but I'm talking about this. It's the 1990s Batmobile, specifically from the Broken Bat saga. In that story, the Batmobile looks very particular. For a start, it looks blue as opposed to black. It also has a shape and an attitude about it, which I had never, again, seen in other media. For example, well, when I first started reading this, certainly in most of the films, it didn't have this sort of this edge to it, this sort of coolness. And this particular design is one which I particularly appreciate. It is rife with Bat symbols and Batman icons, so it's not trying to hide or be overly practical. There's Batman on the seat, there's Batman on the side, there's Batman on the back, there's Batman even, I believe, yes, on the engine. But the whole car is just sleek and cool. It seats two, so it seats Batman and also Robin in that story. And I particularly, in the comics, really like the shape of the sort of the wings on the back of the car. This car for me is always in my top 2 of the Batmobiles. And this one, notably as well, has a sort of a version of Batman's face on the front of the car, which for a long time I found to be deeply naff. Previous versions of the Batmobile do have a very pronounced face on the front, almost like a snowplow to sort of bash through walls of warehouses or whatever. And I think as a teenager and as a young man, I found that just so naff. But actually now it's sort of grown on me, and the design of the Batmobile, for example, in the recent Killing Joke movie, and also other incarnations of the Batmobile recently have intrigued me in that sense. So I've found actually that the face on the front of the Batmobile has grown on me over the years. But in this case, this one was subtle enough that it wasn't in your face. Now there is actually one more, I suppose, honourable mention, and that is this Batmobile. This isn't in my top 5 favourites because I don't think I've got to know it yet. I'm still learning learning about this car's capacities, and also still deciding precisely what I think about the Batman who drives it. But this is the Batmobile from, for example, Batman vs Superman. I like this car because it seems to take lots of elements of previous Batmobiles that I really appreciated. It has the long spike sort of wings at the back, a little bit like Val Kilmer's Batmobile in Batman Forever. It's got the headlights on the front slightly separated out, a bit like Michael Keaton's Batmobile from the Batman movie and Batman Returns. It's got a canopy on the top and a sort of an attitude that's very similar to Christopher Nolan's Batmobile, and the whole thing is, I suppose, reminiscent of this sort of a sleekness and a sense of direction in the design, which I appreciate from the animated series. So in so many ways, this Batmobile should be one of my favourites, and this is actually one which I got for my birthday. It was a sort of little one that you had to construct, die-cast metal. It's a lovely little model. One of the things I don't like about it is the sort of the very prominent machine guns on the front. They sort of bother me a little bit. So I just figured that this one deserved an honourable mention. It's got so many elements which I do like and which I do appreciate, but whether it's broken into my top 5, I'm not sure I could say. It's probably in my top 10. So there you have it. Those are my top 5, 7-ish Batmobiles, and I really enjoy having them around because obviously I like playing with them. but also I really like thinking about them and what they mean. As I sort of touched on, they sort of reflect so much about the technology of the time, and also actually what people expect from Batman and what they expect from therefore what the vehicle can do. So in some ways, actually, I know people criticise it, but maybe having a machine gun smack bang on the front of Ben Affleck's car is telling you something about Batman. That's the point of it. It's there to say, this Batman might sometimes kill people. One final thing is that I recently picked up the Batmobile Owner's Manual, and this has a wonderful lenticular cover. I don't know if it really shows up on camera very well, but this is quite a lot of fun. There are there's an introduction to the Batmobile, talking about what it is, why it's important. And it takes you through driving the Batmobile and what's sort of inside the dashboard, that kind of thing. You have the mechanics of the Batmobile, the run flat tyres, the gel filled sort of tyres there, and various cool bits and bobs. For example, here we have the Batcave with all sorts of previous incarnations of the Batmobile waiting and ready to go. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps actually, just in the same way that Batman sort of holds on to these cars for nostalgia, but also because they all still work, they're all still practical. Maybe actually picking a favourite Batmobile is folly. If it works, then Batman holds on to it, keeps it in good action, in good nick, and so it's ready for action. And maybe that's how we should view the Batmobiles. Maybe they're not meant to be singular. They are Batmobiles, and he's got a cave full of them, so why not have an office full? Anyway, guys, hopefully this has been interesting. Hopefully this has stirred some thoughts and memories for you of the Batmobile over the years. As I say, it's hard to distill why it is that we love this car so much, but people do, and I think with good reason. Anyway, guys, as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.